It was December 16, 1944. Snow fell heavily across the dense forests of Belgium. The world called it the Battle of the Bulge, the last desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler's army. The fields were frozen, the trees splintered from artillery fire, and American soldiers fought with everything they had to stop the advancing German war machine. The U.S. Army, cold, hungry, outnumbered, stood shoulder to shoulder in one of the most brutal winters in modern history. Yet even in that bitter cold, something far greater than victory was being forged: the moral strength of a nation that refused to lose its humanity. When the battle ended, thousands of German soldiers surrendered. They were beaten, exhausted, and terrified. Many of them expected the worst: harsh treatment, revenge, or starvation. After all, they had been told that Americans were monsters. But what happened next would shatter every belief they had about their enemy. The captured German soldiers were loaded into trucks and taken across the Atlantic, to prisoner-of-war camps deep inside the United States. From Texas to Virginia, from Oklahoma to Pennsylvania, over 400,000 German POWs would soon discover a reality they never imagined: life in America. Inside those camps, the U.S. military followed the rules of the Geneva Convention to the letter, sometimes even exceeding them. Prisoners received food, clothing, and medical care. But there was something even more shocking waiting for them: female doctors. To a generation of German men raised under Nazi propaganda, where women were confined to homes, mothers, and little else, the idea of women in medicine was unthinkable. Yet, in America, the U.S. Army proudly placed women on the front lines of healing. Dr. Margaret Hoover, a young physician from Chicago, was one of them. She had joined the Army Medical Corps not to fight but to serve. When she entered the hospital wing of Camp Atterbury in Indiana, rows of wounded German soldiers turned their heads in disbelief. They couldn't believe their eyes. A woman, wearing the U.S. Army uniform, walked between their beds with confidence and compassion. She wasn't there to mock them. She wasn't there to humiliate them. She was there to save their lives. And she did. One POW later wrote in his diary, "It is strange. The Americans treat us better than our own officers did. The women doctors, they look at us like we are human again." The U.S. Army didn't see enemies lying in those hospital beds. They saw men who had been misled by tyranny. For every German wound stitched, every fever treated, and every infection fought, the Army sent a quiet message across the world: America stands for mercy even when the world burns. The medical staff risked everything during these times. Supplies were limited, blood plasma was precious, and diseases like pneumonia and frostbite spread quickly among the captured soldiers. Yet the Army's medical units refused to let any prisoner die needlessly. This was not just about medicine, it was about American ideals. The same ideals that carried young men through Normandy, that raised the flag over Iwo Jima, and that told the world freedom meant compassion even toward your foe. By the spring of 1945, word began to spread through German POW ranks. The Americans, they are not like we were told. Some prisoners even wrote letters home describing baseball games inside the camps, warm meals, and the strange kindness of the very people they once fought to kill. But what left the deepest mark wasn't the food or the freedom, it was the sight of female doctors in uniform, treating them as if they were heroes who had simply lost their way. Because to those women, and to the U.S. Army, every life was worth saving. This was the quiet triumph of America. Not the sound of guns or bombs, but the sound of healing. By the early months of 1945, as the thunder of war still echoed across Europe, something remarkable was happening thousands of miles away on American soil. The German prisoners of war, once soldiers of a regime built on hatred, were waking up each morning to the smell of coffee, the ringing of a camp bell, and the distant laughter of American guards who treated them not as beasts, but as men. Inside the barbed wire fences of Camp Swift in Texas, or Camp Algona in Iowa, life for the POWs was strict yet strangely humane. Each camp followed military discipline: roll call at dawn, work assignments by day, curfew at dusk. But there was no cruelty, no humiliation. The U.S. Army ran these camps with precision and principle. To them, the treatment of prisoners wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a declaration of strength, moral strength. Every new arrival received a physical examination. Army doctors checked their lungs, cleaned their wounds, and handed them soap and fresh uniforms. Many POWs had not been this clean or well-fed since before the war began. And when sickness spread, it wasn't a German medic who came rushing to their aid, it was an American one. That's where the women of the U.S. Army Medical Corps once again stood out like beacons of grace. Across America's POW hospitals, women physicians, nurses, and aides carried out the quiet duty of healing, without prejudice, without fear. For many of them, these were the first German men they had ever seen up close. But to them, the uniform on the patient didn't matter. The heartbeat did. Dr. Helen Tabor, stationed at Camp Shanks in New York, later recalled in an interview. At first they wouldn't look me in the eye. They didn't know what to make of a woman doctor. But after a few weeks they started greeting me in English. They'd say, "Good morning, doctor." Some even smiled. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, decades of cultural barriers began to crumble. These soldiers, once trained to view women as secondary, were now alive because of them. The U.S. Army believed in rehabilitation, not revenge. Every camp had libraries stocked with English books. Classes were organized to teach the prisoners history, mathematics, and American civics. Some POWs learned carpentry or mechanics, skills they would take back home after the war. Others worked on nearby farms, side by side with American civilians, earning small wages they could spend at the camp canteen. One German prisoner named Karl Meyer later wrote, "It was confusing at first. We had been told the Americans were brutal. But here the guards played baseball and sometimes we joined them. We began to wonder, who were the real monsters?" That question lingered in the minds of thousands. Even more surprising were the medical lectures given by American doctors. Female officers like Dr. Hoover and Dr. Tabor occasionally invited POWs to observe basic anatomy classes. To many German prisoners, this was their first encounter with women as scientists, educators, and leaders. It was a revelation. Every few weeks, the Red Cross inspected the camps and reported their findings to Europe. The results astonished the world. American-run POW camps were models of humane treatment, a stark contrast to the cruelty found in Nazi or Soviet prisons. Newspapers back home began to print stories about the captured enemy who learned freedom in captivity. And they weren't exaggerating. The American philosophy was simple but powerful. By showing mercy, you expose tyranny. Every meal served, every wound treated, every life spared reminded the world of what America truly fought for, not just victory on the battlefield but victory of the spirit. By the spring of 1945, many German POWs began to change. They stopped referring to themselves as Hitler's soldiers. They started calling themselves simply men. Some even volunteered to help American doctors with camp sanitation, hospital duties, or farming. They were still prisoners, yes, but they were learning, perhaps for the first time, what decency really looked like. And through it all, the U.S. Army stood proud, unwavering, and disciplined. They had proven that strength wasn't measured only in tanks and guns, but in compassion and character. Soon, however, a new challenge would arise, one that would test the patience of the American guards, the courage of the female doctors, and the moral backbone of an entire nation. Because as the war ended and Nazi Germany fell, tens of thousands of German prisoners faced a question that terrified them more than combat itself. What happens when the fighting stops, but your enemy shows you kindness? May 8, 1945. Across the Atlantic, church bells rang. Flags waved from rooftops. Crowds filled Times Square in a sea of red, white, and blue. The news had finally arrived. Germany had surrendered. For millions of Americans, it was a day of jubilation, relief, and tears. Mothers cried for the sons who would never return, and soldiers embraced each other under the confetti of victory. But for the German prisoners of war held in camps across the United States, the day brought a silence that words could not capture. Inside Camp Atterbury, a group of POWs stood near the wire fences, staring at the American flag fluttering in the spring breeze. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. Their homeland had fallen. The Reich they were told would last 1,000 years had crumbled in less than 12. Dr. Margaret Hoover, now one of the senior medical officers at the camp hospital, remembered the moment vividly. When the announcement came over the radio, the men didn't even move. Some lowered their heads. One of them wept quietly. But when I walked through the ward, they stood up and saluted me. Not as enemies, as soldiers acknowledging the end. The war in Europe was over, but inside those camps, a new kind of battle had begun, the battle of conscience. Many German POWs were haunted by what they'd learned from newspapers and radio broadcasts. The horrors of the concentration camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, were now being revealed to the world. The men who once fought under Hitler's command were forced to confront the truth. The nation they had sworn loyalty to had committed unspeakable crimes. The U.S. Army didn't use that moment for vengeance. Instead, they used it for education. American officers organized film screenings for the prisoners, reels showing the liberation of concentration camps. The German soldiers sat in stunned silence, some burying their faces in their hands. For the female doctors and nurses, it was a heartbreaking sight. These were men they had treated, spoken to, even laughed with, now realizing what their leaders had done in their name. Yet not once did the American staff turn their backs on them. They continued their duty, bandaging wounds, dispensing medicine, and reminding the prisoners that the United States stood for justice, not hatred. Dr. Helen Tabor once said, "I saw shame in their eyes but also something new, gratitude. They knew we could have turned cruel. We didn't. And that changed them." The U.S. Army hospitals soon filled with new cases, malnourished survivors from Europe brought to America for treatment, and POWs suffering from depression, exhaustion, and guilt. Remarkably, some German prisoners volunteered to assist the medical teams, helping those who had survived the camps their own army built. One such volunteer was a young soldier named Friedrich Keller, captured in Normandy in 1944. He worked alongside American nurses, quietly handing out bandages, cleaning wounds, and offering what little comfort he could. When asked why he did it, he simply replied, "Because they saved me. Now I must try to be worth saving." Stories like his spread across the camps, changing the way both sides saw each other. The war had stripped away propaganda and pride, leaving only human beings, tired, broken, but capable of redemption. The Army's female medical staff played a crucial role in this transformation. They treated every man as if he were their own brother or son, no matter the uniform. Their calm voices, steady hands, and unwavering professionalism became symbols of what America truly represented, a nation strong enough to forgive. Every camp had its own rhythm. The sound of marching boots was replaced by the hum of tractors as POWs helped rebuild nearby towns. In some places, locals would see the same men who once fought their sons now working in fields, side by side with American farmers. The miracle wasn't just that these prisoners were treated humanely, it was that they began to believe in the ideals of their captors. Freedom, fairness, dignity. Words they had once mocked, now words they would carry home. And as the weeks passed, one question echoed through every barracks and hospital ward. Would they ever see Germany again? The war was over, but the future was uncertain. Some prisoners feared being handed over to the Soviets. Others dreaded returning to ruins. The United States had given them food, safety, even friendship, and now they faced the terrifying prospect of leaving it all behind. Dr. Hoover wrote in her final wartime journal entry, "We healed our enemies. We did it because that is who we are. America wins its wars not only with guns but with grace." And that grace, that unshakable belief in mercy over vengeance, would soon ripple far beyond the camp fences. Because for many of these German soldiers, America had not just conquered them. America had converted them. The summer sun of 1946 rose over quiet American farmlands, casting golden light on barbed wire fences that were now beginning to disappear. The war had been over for more than a year, and across the United States, thousands of German prisoners of war were being prepared for repatriation. The camps that had once echoed with roll calls and marching feet now hummed with the sound of trains, paperwork, and farewells. The men who arrived as enemies were leaving as something entirely different, witnesses to the humanity of their captors. Inside the medical ward at Camp Atterbury, Dr. Margaret Hoover stood by a bedside, filling out one final medical form. The patient, a young German soldier with a scar across his cheek, had recovered from tuberculosis under her care. His name was Lucas Weber, barely 23. As he prepared to leave, he shook her hand, his voice trembling. "If Germany had women like you in uniform," he said softly, "maybe we would have never gone to war." It was a moment she would never forget. For many German POWs, their time in America had been an awakening. They had learned that strength didn't mean cruelty, that discipline could coexist with kindness, and that the American soldier, whether on the battlefield or in a hospital, carried both courage and conscience in equal measure. The U.S. Army had proven something profound. You could defeat tyranny without becoming tyrants yourself. At Camp Shanks, Dr. Helen Tabor watched as another group of prisoners boarded trucks bound for New York Harbor. The men wore clean clothes, carried Red Cross parcels, and clutched papers stamped with the U.S. Army seal, their ticket home. Some smiled and waved to the guards who had once pointed rifles at them. Others wept silently. In the months leading up to their departure, the Army had intensified its education programs. The POWs attended lectures on democracy, freedom of speech, and the structure of the American government. They watched films about the Constitution and debated in small groups under the guidance of U.S. officers. To the Army, this wasn't propaganda, it was preparation. They knew these men would return to a broken nation. If even a handful of them carried back the values of liberty and respect, Then perhaps Germany could rebuild not just its cities but its soul. And it worked. When the first ships carrying German POWs docked in Bremerhaven, many of the returning men spoke not of bitterness or humiliation, but of gratitude. They told their countrymen about the American camps, the fair treatment, the food, the education, and the women in uniform who had treated them like human beings. One repatriated prisoner, writing to a friend, said, "We were treated like guests, not enemies. They showed us a better way to be strong." This testimony spread quickly across post-war Germany. Newspapers published stories of humane treatment in the United States. It was hard for many Germans to believe, after years of propaganda about the cruel American invader, that their defeated soldiers had been healed by the very people they fought. In the ruins of Berlin, Allied officers noticed a surprising trend. Former POWs who had returned from the U.S. were among the most cooperative and optimistic about rebuilding. Many refused to rejoin extremist movements. Some volunteered to assist in democratic institutions. A few even joined humanitarian efforts across Europe. Historians would later call this phenomenon re-education through decency. The U.S. Army hadn't lectured them into change. It had shown them. And at the heart of that quiet revolution were the female doctors and nurses who never forgot their mission, to heal without hate. Dr. Hoover and her colleagues went back to civilian life, their wartime experiences shaping the rest of their careers. They were pioneers not only in medicine but in morality. They had stared into the eyes of their nation's enemies and seen not monsters but men in need. Their service stood as a testament to America's values: strength with compassion, power with principle. The same spirit that raised the flag at Iwo Jima also extended a hand to a fallen foe. In a time when the world was divided between conquerors and conquered, America chose to lead by example, to win hearts as well as wars. Even decades later, German veterans would tell their children and grandchildren stories that sounded almost unbelievable. Stories of American guards who shared cigarettes, of nurses who spoke gently in broken German, of doctors who saved their lives without asking for anything in return. Some of them would later visit the United States as tourists or immigrants, standing before the Statue of Liberty, a monument they once thought symbolized an enemy nation, and whisper, "Thank you." For America, this was more than victory. It was vindication. The U.S. Army had proven that democracy, when armed with courage and guided by conscience, could change even the hearts of those who once sought to destroy it. But this story was not over. Because as the German prisoners returned home, many of the American doctors and nurses faced their own battles, not with guns or disease but with memory. They had seen war. They had seen hate. And now they had to return to a world that could never truly understand what they had lived through. The war had ended, but for them the echoes of mercy had only just begun. The war was over, but for America's women in uniform, another kind of battle had just begun. When Dr. Margaret Hoover stepped off the train in Chicago in the autumn of 1946, the cheers of victory had faded into the hum of rebuilding. The city was alive again, factories running, soldiers returning home, flags still fluttering in windows, but for her, everything felt different. She had spent years wearing the olive-green uniform of the United States Army Medical Corps, patching wounds, saving lives, and standing shoulder to shoulder with men in a world that once doubted her place. Now, as she walked into a civilian hospital for her first day back at work, a colleague glanced at her uniform and said, "So, you're one of the lady doctors who treated the Nazis?" Dr. Hoover smiled politely. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done, and so did every man whose life she'd saved behind barbed wire. Across the country, hundreds of women like her were returning from service. Some had been stationed in field hospitals near the front lines. Others had worked in American POW camps. But all of them carried the same memories, the faces of men they had healed, the horrors they had witnessed, and the pride of knowing they had served under the flag of a nation that believed in mercy. The U.S. Army had given these women more than uniforms. It had given them purpose. In 1942, when the Women's Army Corps and the Army Nurse Corps expanded, few believed that women could handle the rigors of war. Yet by 1945, their contribution was undeniable. They had treated the wounded at Normandy, tended to the dying at Bastogne, and cared for prisoners of war who never imagined women could wear rank and command respect. Dr. Helen Tabor once reflected on those years in a speech at a veterans gathering. "We were told our place was in the home. But in the war, our place was wherever a human being needed help. The Army gave us the chance to prove that compassion is strength." The American public began to take notice. Newspapers published stories about the angels of the camps, the female doctors who treated captured Germans with the same care they gave to U.S. soldiers. Some readers were shocked. Others were inspired. But most felt a deep pride that even in the darkest days of war, America had chosen to rise above hatred. The Army, recognizing their service, began awarding commendations to medical officers who had worked in POW facilities. Citations praised their exceptional dedication to the humanitarian principles of the United States Army. For the women, it was validation not just of their skill, but of their belief that kindness could be a weapon of peace. Dr. Hoover continued her work in medicine, pioneering new methods in battlefield rehabilitation. Her experiences treating frostbite, malnutrition, and trauma among POWs helped shape early studies on post-war recovery and mental health, what we now call PTSD. She often told her students, "War teaches you what it means to be human. If you can heal your enemy, you've already won the greater war." Meanwhile, her former patients, the German soldiers she once tended, began writing letters. Many had settled back in Germany, now part of the nation's slow rebirth under Allied supervision. Their letters spoke of gratitude, of reflection, and of the strange warmth they felt when remembering the American camps. One wrote, "When I think of America, I do not think of bombs or guns. I think of a woman in uniform who saved my life." Those words echoed across oceans. They became small but powerful symbols of the New World Order, one not built on domination but on dignity. The U.S. Army took note. When future generations of soldiers were trained, their instructors reminded them that the strength of the United States wasn't just in its firepower, but in its fairness. The legacy of those wartime doctors and nurses became part of the Army's identity, a legacy of compassion that continues in military medicine to this day. Still, life wasn't easy for them. Many female veterans faced skepticism from male colleagues. They were told to forget the war, to go back to normal life. But normalcy was impossible for those who had seen the face of both evil and redemption. They had witnessed the best and worst of humanity. They had looked into the eyes of their enemies and found the courage to forgive. In interviews decades later, Dr. Tabor summed it up best. "We were soldiers of mercy. We didn't fight with bullets, but we fought just as hard, for the soul of our country." Their fight would leave a mark far beyond the camps and the hospitals. It would change how America, and the world, saw women soldiers and the meaning of victory itself. Because in the end, history remembered not only who won the war, but how they won it. And America, through its daughters in uniform, had won it with grace. The year was 1947. Germany was a scarred land, its cities reduced to rubble, its people haunted by defeat, hunger, and shame. The war that had begun with parades and speeches had ended in silence and ruins. Smoke still rose from the edges of Berlin, where children scavenged for bread among shattered bricks. But in the midst of that devastation, something unexpected was taking root, a whisper of gratitude, a flicker of hope. It began with stories. Stories carried by men who had once worn gray uniforms marked with the eagle and swastika. They had returned from America, from the land of their former enemies, carrying tales that no one in post-war Germany could quite believe. They spoke of prison camps where the food was decent, the guards were polite, and the doctors, some of them women, had treated them like brothers, not beasts. They told of baseball games, of English classes, of American officers who talked about freedom instead of revenge. To people living among ruins and ration carts, these stories sounded like fiction. But they were true. In villages across Bavaria, Saxony, and Hesse, returning POWs became unlikely messengers of American values. They described how the U.S. Army had lived by its own principles, how it had followed the Geneva Convention not out of obligation but out of conscience. They spoke of Dr. Margaret Hoover, of the lady doctor in Indiana, and of the American nurse who smiled even at wounded Germans. It was these personal encounters that began to soften the hearts of a generation raised on hate. Historians later called it the quiet diplomacy of kindness. The U.S. Army had not only defeated Germany's armies, it had also planted the first seeds of a future alliance. Those seeds grew not in conference rooms or treaties, but in the memories of men who had seen the true face of America, decent, disciplined, and compassionate. In 1947, as the Marshall Plan was announced, many Germans greeted it not as a cynical act of politics but as an extension of what they had already witnessed firsthand: America helping its enemies rebuild. And behind that spirit of generosity stood the same ideals that had guided the U.S. Army through the POW years: mercy and victory, strength and compassion. Former prisoners became interpreters, laborers, and later bridge builders between two nations. Many wrote letters to their former American guards and doctors. Some even returned years later as immigrants, bringing their families to the country that had once held them captive. One such man was Karl Mayr, the same POW who had marveled at the Americans' kindness back in Camp Swift, Texas. When he returned to his hometown near Hamburg, he became a schoolteacher. In his classroom he spoke not of war but of democracy. When his students asked him what America was really like, he would smile and say, "America taught me how to be free." The transformation was real. By the early 1950s, as the Cold War dawned and the world divided again, West Germany emerged as a steadfast ally of the United States. The foundation of that alliance wasn't just strategic, it was moral. It rested on trust, built in those POW camps, where mercy had replaced malice. Meanwhile, back in America, newspapers occasionally ran stories about reunions between former German prisoners and their American caretakers. One particularly moving article from 1953 told of a former POW who returned to visit the very camp where he had been held, now a quiet training facility, and placed a bouquet of flowers at the gate. The note read, "To the U.S. Army, thank you for teaching me what humanity means." Dr. Margaret Hoover received dozens of such letters over the years. One of them came from Lucas Weber, the young man with the scar across his cheek. He wrote from Bonn, where he now worked as a civil engineer. "You once told me mercy is stronger than hate," he wrote. "You were right. I am raising my sons to believe the same." For Hoover, that letter meant more than any medal. It was proof that the work of America's women in uniform had outlasted the war. Their compassion had crossed oceans and borders, reshaping the image of the United States in the very heart of its former enemy. This wasn't just soft power, it was moral power. The kind that cannot be forced or faked. The kind that endures. The German POW experience became one of the most remarkable chapters in the story of post-war reconciliation. And at the center of it all stood the U.S. Army, not just as a force of arms, but as a force of ideals. The same army that had stormed Omaha Beach had also taught mercy in the heart of the Midwest. The same nation that could unleash atomic fire had chosen, instead, to heal with open hands. By 1955, a decade after the war, Germany was no longer a defeated foe, it was an ally, a partner in peace. And though few remembered the names of the doctors, nurses, and guards who had helped make that possible, their legacy lived on in every handshake, every alliance, every flag flown side by side. The world had changed, and America had led the change not just through might, but through morality. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not the one won in battle, but the one won in the heart of an enemy who learns to call you friend. By the mid-1950s, the world had changed. The fires of World War II had cooled, but a new tension was rising. The Cold War. Nations armed themselves not just with bombs but with ideas. Democracy against dictatorship. Freedom against fear. And in that new struggle, the moral reputation of the United States mattered more than ever. It wasn't only about power anymore, it was about proof. Proof that America's values could endure even in the face of hate. Proof that compassion wasn't weakness. Proof that mercy, once shown to an enemy, could become the foundation of peace. The story of the German POWs had quietly become part of that proof. In military academies across the United States, instructors began using the POW experience as a model of conduct, a case study in the moral strength of the American soldier. West Point cadets learned not only about tactics and logistics, but about the duty of honor. A soldier's job, one manual read, is not only to win wars, but to defend the ideals for which those wars are fought. And among those ideals was the sacred belief that every life had dignity. Female officers like Dr. Margaret Hoover and Dr. Helen Tabor became symbols of that ideal. Though their names rarely appeared in textbooks, their actions had quietly influenced an entire generation of military medicine. Their service proved that courage wasn't confined to the battlefield, it lived also in the hospital tents, in the wards, in the quiet compassion shown to the broken and the defeated. In 1956, the U.S. Army Medical Department held a ceremony at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, honoring women who had served in World War II. General Leonard Heaton, the Surgeon General of the Army, addressed the crowd. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. These women showed the world what America stands for. They treated the wounded, the captured, and the condemned with equal care. They reminded us that strength without compassion is tyranny, and that compassion without strength is weakness. But together they are what make us American. The audience rose to its feet. Among the honored guests sat Dr. Hoover, now in her early 40s, her uniform replaced by a civilian dress, her service ribbons still shining. She hadn't come for applause. She came because she wanted the younger women in uniform to know that their work mattered, that their kindness could shape history just as powerfully as any general's command. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the effects of America's wartime mercy continued to ripple. West Germany, rebuilt from ruins, had joined NATO in 1955, standing shoulder to shoulder with the same nation it once fought against. It was a partnership born not just of politics but of respect. And behind that respect lay the quiet memories of men who had been treated with humanity when they least deserved it. Some of those men became doctors themselves. Others became teachers, engineers, mayors. But almost all of them carried with them an unspoken loyalty, not to the ideology they once served, but to the values they had seen in America. That was the real victory of the U.S. Army, not just the defeat of tyranny but the conversion of hearts. The story of the female doctors also began inspiring change at home. More women entered medical schools in the 1950s and 1960s, many citing wartime figures like Dr. Hoover and the Army Nurse Corps as role models. Their courage had opened doors that could never again be closed. When asked in an interview years later about her proudest achievement, Dr. Hoover didn't mention medals or recognition. She said simply, "I proved that kindness doesn't need permission." Her legacy lived on in the generations that followed, in the nurses who served in Korea, the doctors who treated the wounded in Vietnam, and the medics who brought aid to war-torn villages across the world. Each time an American soldier extended a hand to help a stranger, the spirit of those World War II women lived again. By the 1970s, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had become one of the most respected institutions of its kind, known not only for its skill but for its ethics. From field hospitals in Saigon to humanitarian missions in Africa, American military doctors carried forward the same message that had once been whispered through POW camps across the Midwest: mercy is might. Historians would later agree that the humane treatment of German POWs helped shape America's image abroad. It became a cornerstone of how the world viewed American power, not as domination but as leadership through decency. When Germany became one of America's closest allies, few remembered the faces of the men and women who made it possible. But somewhere in an old black and white photograph, you could see them, young women in U.S. Army uniforms, walking through a hospital ward full of former enemies, offering medicine, food, and something far rarer, forgiveness. It was the face of America at its finest. And as the decades passed, their story continued to echo in every new generation of soldiers, doctors, and citizens. A reminder that greatness isn't measured in victories won, but in the mercy shown when the fighting is done. By the late 20th century, the world no longer trembled under the boots of World War. The cities once scarred by bombings had been rebuilt, the nations once divided by hate were now linked by trade and diplomacy. But the Cold War had cast a long shadow, one that tested not only weapons but hearts. And in this new era, the legacy of mercy that began in the POW camps of the 1940s was still shaping how America moved through the world. The story of the U.S. Army's female doctors, those who had treated German prisoners with dignity, had never made front-page headlines. Yet their spirit quietly guided America's every act of compassion overseas. Every time the Army sent a medical unit to heal instead of fight, every time an American soldier shared food with a hungry child in a foreign land, the same message echoed: America helps, even when it doesn't have to. It began again in Korea. Winter, 1951. The hills were frozen, the fighting brutal. Yet amid the chaos, American medical officers, many of them women, worked in mobile field hospitals, saving not just U.S. troops but also wounded civilians and captured enemy soldiers. They treated them all the same way Dr. Margaret Hoover once had, with fairness, precision, and heart. Reporters visiting the front lines wrote of the American Angels, who risked sniper fire to save lives. One article from Life magazine described a female Army doctor holding a wounded North Korean boy, whispering softly as she wrapped his bandaged arm. She looked like she was holding her own son, the correspondent wrote. And in that moment I understood what made the American soldier different. That difference, the ability to fight fiercely yet heal fearlessly, became America's signature strength. When the Vietnam War erupted a decade later, that same spirit endured. In jungle hospitals and field tents, American medics treated both soldiers and villagers, often under fire. They carried out surgeries by flashlight, stitched wounds with trembling hands, and refused to let their humanity break, even when the world around them seemed lost. One Army nurse, inspired by the stories of WWII's female doctors, said in an interview, "They taught us that mercy is not a weakness. It's the hardest kind of courage there is." Through every conflict and crisis, the U.S. Army Medical Corps stood as the quiet embodiment of America's ideals: honor, service, and compassion. From the deserts of Iraq to the disaster zones of Haiti, American military doctors would arrive not as conquerors, but as caretakers. And that reputation, The image of the soldier who heals became one of America's most powerful tools of diplomacy. World leaders took notice. In 1963, during a NATO summit, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer praised the United States not just for rebuilding Europe, but for its unparalleled moral leadership. He later told President Kennedy privately, "Your soldiers taught our men not only how to fight but how to forgive." That single line captured a truth that no treaty could ever write. America's mercy had become its greatest weapon. Back home, the U.S. Army continued to honor the women who started it all. At reunions and military ceremonies, names like Dr. Hoover and Dr. Tabor were spoken with quiet respect. They were no longer just doctors. They were legends, symbols of the America that healed a broken world. Their influence extended far beyond the military. In universities, humanitarian programs, and medical schools, their example inspired a generation of American doctors to volunteer abroad, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Peace Corps, founded in 1961, carried forward that same tradition: service through compassion, help through humanity. By the 1980s, the United States had become the world's first responder to earthquakes, famines, and wars. And everywhere the American flag appeared on a field hospital or supply crate, people remembered the same lesson that the German POWs had learned decades earlier. When America shows up, it shows up to help. The Cold War was fought with ideologies, but it was won with ideals. While others built walls, America built trust. While others used fear, America used faith. Faith in freedom, faith in decency, faith that doing the right thing always mattered even when no one was watching. And at the heart of that faith stood the example of the U.S. Army's doctors. Those women in olive uniforms who, decades earlier, had looked into the faces of their enemies and seen not hate, but humanity. Their story became a living doctrine, passed quietly from one generation of soldiers to the next. From the POW camps of 1944 to the humanitarian missions of the 1980s, their message never changed. To be American is to stand strong, and to show mercy. As the 20th century neared its end, the U.S. Army's reputation as the world's most powerful and most principled force was unshakable. And the world, once divided by war, now looked to America not just for defense, but for hope. The women who healed their enemies had done something no bullet ever could. They had made compassion a cornerstone of power. And that, more than anything, was the reason the world still believed in the promise of the United States of America. The dawn of the 21st century came with new battles, not against empires but against fear, chaos, and suffering. The enemies had changed their names and faces, but the mission of the United States Army remained the same: to protect, to serve, and to uphold the values that defined a free world. And through every war, every crisis, every humanitarian disaster, one light never dimmed: the light first lit by those women in the hospitals of 1944. When the towers fell on September 11, 2001, the United States faced one of the darkest moments in its history. In that moment of grief and rage, America could have chosen vengeance alone. But instead it chose purpose. Soldiers deployed not only to fight but to rebuild. The U.S. Army sent medical units, engineers, and aid workers into war zones to bring stability and hope to broken nations. In Afghanistan and Iraq, amid the dust and danger, American military doctors once again found themselves treating not only their own wounded, but civilians, men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. They operated under the same belief that guided Dr. Margaret Hoover decades before: every life mattered. In a small field hospital near Kandahar, an Army physician named Captain Laura Bennett delivered a baby girl whose mother had been wounded by shrapnel. Local villagers gathered around, watching as the American soldier held the newborn in her arms. For a brief moment, the war outside disappeared. A local elder, tears in his eyes, whispered through a translator, "She fights like a warrior but heals like a mother." That moment, small, quiet, and unseen by most, carried the same spirit that had defined America since the Second World War: the strength to fight when necessary, the courage to heal when possible. Across the Middle East, countless such stories unfolded. American medics built clinics in villages that had never known electricity. Army nurses vaccinated children who had never seen a doctor. Engineers purified water, rebuilt schools, and restored hope, all under the same flag that once flew over POW camps where mercy had triumphed over hate. Even when the world criticized, the mission endured. Because America's greatness was never about being perfect. It was about being principled. The Army knew that true power was measured not by fear but by faith. Faith in humanity, faith in decency, faith that the good you do in secret can change the world forever. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, it wasn't just civilians who rushed to help, it was the U.S. Army. The same uniforms that once treated enemies now pulled fellow Americans from floodwaters, set up hospitals and schools and restored order to chaos. That seamless transition, from warrior to rescuer, was a reflection of a legacy born generations earlier in those wartime infirmaries. The same compassion echoed again in 2010, when a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck Haiti. Within hours, U.S. Army aircraft filled the skies, delivering food, medicine, and doctors. Among them was Major Emily Carter, a surgeon who traced her calling back to her grandmother, a World War II nurse who had treated German prisoners. Major Carter, standing in a ruined Port-au-Prince hospital, said to a journalist, "My grandmother used to tell me that when America saves lives, it doesn't just heal people, it heals the world's faith in goodness." Those words became a headline. But more importantly, they became a reminder that the moral thread connecting the past and the present had never broken. Through every conflict and catastrophe, the spirit of those World War II women, the healers of enemies, continued to live on in every American soldier who knelt beside a wounded stranger. By 2020, U.S. Army humanitarian missions had reached every continent. From medical outreach in Africa to disaster response in Asia, the same stars and stripes that once flew over war zones now flew over relief camps, symbolizing not conquest but compassion. Even America's allies, Germany among them, now worked side by side with U.S. forces in peacekeeping missions. Former enemies had become partners in mercy. German soldiers served under NATO command alongside Americans, rebuilding nations together. And sometimes in shared hospitals, young German and American medics would look at each other and smile, unaware that decades earlier, their grandparents had once stood on opposite sides of history. That silent bond, forged by compassion, sealed by respect, was the truest measure of victory. Because America hadn't just defeated tyranny. It had redefined power itself. Power wasn't the ability to destroy. It was the ability to rebuild. And every act of healing, from the battlefields of World War II to the rubble of modern wars, traced back to one truth: the U.S. Army's strength was rooted in its mercy. The world had seen empires rise and fall, but America's greatness endured because it was built on something stronger than fear. It was built on humanity. And through it all, the torch that those female doctors first lit in 1944 never went out. It still burned in the hearts of every American soldier, every medic, every humanitarian who believed that even in the darkest of times, compassion could light the way. It is the 21st century. The guns of World War II are silent, their echoes fading into history. But the lessons, the courage, the compassion, the unbreakable spirit of the U.S. Army, still live on. From Normandy's beaches to the deserts of Iraq, from the frozen forests of Belgium to the hospitals of Afghanistan, the same story has been told again and again. When the world breaks, America shows up to heal it. Because that is who the United States Army has always been, not just a force of war but a force of mercy. The story began in 1944 with a few brave women walking through rows of wounded prisoners, German soldiers who expected hatred but found healing instead. Those women didn't know it at the time, but they were changing history. They were redefining what it meant to win. They showed the world that American victory wasn't measured in the number of enemies defeated, it was measured in the number of lives saved. When Dr. Margaret Hoover reached out her hand to treat a frightened young German POW, she wasn't just saving a man's life. She was saving an idea. The idea that humanity could still exist in a world torn apart by hate. That idea became the moral heartbeat of America. It pulsed through every military hospital, every humanitarian mission, every rescue operation that followed. Decades later, as U.S. Army helicopters carried food and medicine to disaster zones, the spirit of those wartime doctors flew with them. As medics knelt beside the wounded in dusty villages, their compassion became the modern face of freedom. And as America stood guard over a fragile world, its soldiers carried more than rifles. They carried the belief that power is nothing without principle. In 2019, at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., a small group of historians unveiled a bronze statue at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. It depicted a woman in uniform tending to a wounded soldier, her expression calm, her posture strong. The plaque beneath her read, "To the healers who served with honor, and taught the world that mercy is might." Among the attendees that day were descendants of German POWs, now proud citizens of a free democratic Germany, allies of the very nation that once captured their fathers. They stood silently, tears in their eyes, as the American flag was raised. One elderly man, whose father had been treated in a U.S. camp in 1945, whispered to a reporter, "My father said the Americans didn't just save his life, they saved his soul." That was the true victory. Not just over fascism or fear, but over the human instinct for revenge. The U.S. Army had proven something no empire ever could, that strength is greatest when it's guided by compassion. Through wars and peace, triumph and tragedy, that lesson endured. It became the unseen backbone of American leadership, the reason nations trusted U.S. soldiers not only as warriors but as protectors. Because the world knew this simple truth: when the American flag appears, hope follows. Even in times of doubt, when the world questioned America's choices or motives, the heart of the Army, its doctors, its medics, its humanitarian spirit, reminded everyone of what the country truly stood for: freedom, dignity, decency. And it all began with a handful of women who refused to see their enemies as monsters, who believed that saving a life, any life, was a sacred duty. Their courage rippled through generations. It inspired presidents and generals, soldiers and civilians, and millions of ordinary Americans who believe that doing the right thing matters, even when no one is watching. Theirs was not a story of war. It was a story of what comes after war: the healing, the rebuilding, the mercy that turns enemies into allies and strangers into brothers. It was, and still is, the story of America. So when history remembers the greatest victories of the U.S. Army, it should remember not just the battles won, but the kindness shown in the quiet aftermath. Because long after the smoke cleared and the flags were folded, it wasn't the roar of cannons that defined America's greatness. It was the whisper of compassion, the steady hands that healed, the unwavering belief that mercy, even in war, is the highest form of courage. And as long as that belief endures, as long as there are men and women in uniform who choose to save when others would destroy, the light lit in 1944 will never fade. It will burn forever. In the hospitals of heroes. In the hearts of the free. In the promise of the United States of America. Because America's greatest power has always been its mercy.